Well, good morning and welcome to this, the fifth session of our exciting adventure in church history. And when I say that, I'm not being the least bit facetious. I think it is a very exciting adventure. And I hope that you agree, and maybe you do, or you wouldn't be back for yet another session in this. Today we're going to be covering quite a lot of time in terms of period of history, actually about 400 years, looking at the time period between, say, 1100 and 1500 AD. And just a note on technology today. I've had a continuing issue with trying to make sure that these things are done. When I say these, I mean these online sessions, both worship and this class, that they are done as best I can possibly do them. One of the continuing struggles I've had is in audio, and you may very well already know that. And I'm never happy with exactly the production that I've been getting. So today I'm actually going to be using this little handheld microphone and see if that improves it. However, I have to say that I'm having a hard time for some reason, which I don't understand, keeping my speakers on. And so if this thing turns off while we're doing this again, I'm just going to have to go without any additional sound, and hopefully we'll be sufficiently loud for you to be able to hear all this. I want to revisit an issue that we've talked about a couple of times, and I wouldn't be surprised that we talk about it a few more times before this course ends, because I think it's a very important topic. And that really has to do with the relationship of Christianity with the larger culture in which it finds itself, or the individual cultures, because it certainly finds itself in the midst of more than one of them. And so this time I want to ask, or get into this issue by asking the question, what does it mean for someone to be a follower of a particular religion? And I guess one of the most basic ways of defining what it means to be a follower of a religion would be that if someone was to be intently following the founders of a particular religion. For instance, if you are a Muslim, then you are intently following the teachings of Muhammad. If you are a member of Confucianism, then you are following the teachings of Confucius. If you are a Jew, then you are following the teachings of Judaism, which essentially is the teachings of Moses and the Torah. And of course, if you are a Christian, then if you're going to be intently following the teachings of the founder, you're going to be intently following the teachings of Jesus. That's one meaning of what it might be to be a follower of a particular religion. To be a follower of a particular religion also might mean that you are intently following the teachings of a particular institution that might do no more than simply borrow the name of the founder of that religion. In other words, you may think that you are following the founder when in fact you're following something that is totally different, something that may have more to do with the culture than it does with the founder of that particular religion. Another way of being a follower of a particular religion is to, hey, just go ahead and do whatever you want. Call yourself by the name of that religion, and therefore everything you do is part of what that religion teaches, because you're a part of it and you're doing such and such, so it must be part of that religion. There's another way, I think, that, this may sound a little weird to some people, but it probably happens a lot more frequently than we acknowledge, and that is, if you're going to be a follower of a particular religion, then just claim that you have a special revelation personally from the founder of that religion, and that other people ought to be agreeing with you and following the instructions that were given to you personally by that founder of that religion, in person, in a vision, in an audible voice, or whatever the case may be. So there are probably a number of things of what it might mean for someone to claim to be a follower of a particular religion. Now the point of all of this goes back to this whole business about Constantine and whether or not it was a good thing for the church when Constantine became a Christian and made Christianity sort of the official religion, or the at least the more dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Of course, it was a good thing if you were experiencing persecution and the persecution stopped, and it's hard to argue that that's good. You like persecution to stop. But on the other hand, what did it do to the essential nature of the church? And was that a positive or a negative thing? Well, today our first topic is that we are going to get directly involved in a particular issue that I would say confronts this issue about whether or not the activities of the church have more to do with the culture, with the institution, than it does with the actual teachings of Jesus. And then by the end of our session today, hopefully we'll get around to talking about a direct contrast to this first issue, in which may have been more to do with the culture and the institution, compared with the later example of someone truly following the dictates or the teachings of Jesus. So let's get into it. What I'm really talking about here initially is we want to talk about, first of all, the Crusades. Now, I think that most people have heard of the Crusades. They know something about what the Crusades are all about. They probably know that when people talk about the Crusades these days, I think most of the time the Crusades are held up as an example of the church betraying its better instincts and doing things that are probably truly outrageous. But while most of us probably have some idea about what the Crusades were, we probably don't know a whole lot about them, about how they developed or how they actually turned out and so forth. So we're going to try to take care of some of that this morning in this time that we have here together. I think my very first exposure to the Crusades actually came watching an old movie on television starring Errol Flynn, and he was starring as King Richard the Lionhearted, and he was off in the Holy Lands fighting some evil Muslim named Saladin. And as I recall, not doing it terribly well, and we'll get into a little more specifics about that in a bit. But that's the first time I heard about the Crusades, I think, and all I knew was that here was a Christian engaging in a war against evil and vicious Muslims. Or I knew nothing about how that happened, or why it happened, or what was involved in all of that. But nevertheless, that was the impression that I was left with, and I would guess that that's actually part of the message that the filmmakers wanted to get across. Righteous Christians fighting evil Muslims. Of course, that was probably made, I think, in the 1940s. There was very little question about that then, and maybe there's very little question about that now, although it might be harder these days to make a movie like that for a variety of reasons. That probably wasn't the major reason that they wanted to make that movie. The biggest reason was that they wanted to make another swashbuckler with the greatest swashbuckler of all time, Errol Flynn, and they certainly did that. So anyway, that was my exposure to the Crusades, and I don't know where you heard about them. Maybe you heard about them same place, same time as I did. But to get into what the Crusades were really all about, I'll let you know that there were essentially 8 major Crusades, and they went on for a period of almost 200 years, beginning actually in about 1096, or at least that was when the call for the first crusade came, and the last crusade not occurring until 1291. It was actually in 1095 that Pope Urban II proclaimed a great new project for the church. Church needed a project. Church had a lot of things going on that probably were not most to be desired by a pope or by anybody else, and not the least of which maybe was some sense of division and maybe another sense of boredom. Needed to do something to try to re-energize the church, maybe try to pull the church together. And so Pope Urban came up with a plan. Quite a plan it was. The issue behind the plan was that, if you remember last time we talked about the rise of Islam in the 8th century, in the 700s, and how the Muslim religion swept westward through the lands, especially of Eastern Christianity, and conquered all of those lands, eventually moving as far west as Spain, but then being eventually driven back, but occupying things as far west as Constantinople. And so you had a couple of serious issues going on with that occupation of Christian lands by the Muslims. And the first is that the Christians were being persecuted by the Muslims. That was not good. And the second thing was there were all these holy sites in the Holy Lands that were now occupied by Muslim hands. And Christians did not have the kind of freedom that they had to make pilgrimage to such places as the site of the Holy Sepulchre in Bethlehem and so forth. And so Pope Urban said, well, we've got to do something. We've got to stop this persecution of our brothers and sisters over in those lands, and we've got to reclaim those holy sites for Christianity. So he basically called for people to go to war to achieve the ends of protecting those Christians and reclaiming those sites from the Muslim hordes. And the Pope made a promise that all of those who went off to fight in this holy war against Islam, if they died in that struggle, their sins would be immediately forgiven and they would go immediately to heaven. Quite a promise. Remember that this was in a time when especially there was not a sense that God's grace was going to get you to heaven. You were also going to have to earn it, if by no other means than by suffering in purgatory. And eventually, we'll talk more about this too as time goes on, but the rise of indulgences, which was a matter of you could actually pay for your own escape from purgatory and moving on up into heaven, or so you could do it for somebody who had already died. So those things you didn't have to deal with if you went off and fought it and died in a crusade, because you could immediately be forgiven and immediately go to heaven. So again, good deal. So people were willing to go on a crusade because, and this was the cry that arose throughout Europe, God wills it. This is what God intends for us to do. We've got to go fight for our faith. We've got to destroy those evil Muslim hordes. Anyway, now for years, for centuries really, the church had tried to limit wars. Never by simply outlawing them or by simply proclaiming that wars were all bad under all circumstances. The greatest thinker the church had produced up to that time was Augustine, and Augustine produced what has been called ever since the just war theory, and laid out a set of guidelines by which something could be called a righteous war, a just war. The problem was everybody who wanted to go to war had a way in which they could define their war as a just war, so wars continued just fine. So a couple of other ideas came up. The first was called the Truce of God. And the Truce of God was simply a stipulation, which honestly didn't work very well, but the stipulation was that there would be no fighting on weekends or holy days or during Lent. As a matter of fact, just to pick this up a little bit here, going back to good old King Richard the Lionhearted, he just seemed to like to fight. I mean, the crusade was one thing, but he liked to fight other times, other places as well. In fact, he really didn't spend much time in England. He was the king, but he, again, seemed to like it, seemed to like to be fighting out there in various places. Did I say spent little time in England? In fact, one of the things that most of us know about King Richard the Lionhearted was that he was out of England, but he had a defender, somebody who was taking up for his cause back in England, and that was an outlaw named Robin Hood, who fought against the evil Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham and so forth, trying to protect the legacy of King Richard while he was out fighting the evil Muslims and so forth and so on. And, you know, I think back to the days of high school and the things that, wow, the wasted time and all the things I didn't learn. But I did have a church history class, and I'm not sure I can remember very much specifically from the things that came up in that church history class, but I remember very specifically the teacher, Mr. Carver, at Sandusky High, talking about King Richard the Lionhearted fighting some battle for some reason at a castle in France. And he told how a 12-year-old boy in the castle fired an arrow that struck King Richard and ultimately mortally wounded him. But before he died, he did forgive the boy who shot the arrow and wounded him mortally. But then I remember Mr. Carver saying, however, after King Richard died, they ignored his forgiveness of the little boy, the 12-year-old boy, and they skinned him alive. So there's what I remember from church history class, or from world history class in Sandusky High all those years ago. King Richard the Lionhearted and what happened to the guy who shot the arrow. But nevertheless, so there was the truce of God. Oh, by the way, what I didn't mention, the reason I brought up King Richard the Lionhearted there once again was that after he was killed, the rumor went out that the reason he was killed is that it was punishment because he was fighting during Lent. So some people at least took it all very seriously. That was the truce of God. There was another plan called the peace of God. And this one tried to protect women, tried to protect old people, tried to protect priests and farmers and animals and agricultural tools and so forth. However, it didn't really work very well. They actually formed a priestly police force, which was intended, I guess, to enforce the peace. However, an awful lot of people just saw that as one more army that they had to fight against. And so that priestly police force actually was out there fighting battles. And in one battle alone, over 700 priests were killed. So again, these things like the truce of God and the peace of God were let's say they were failing. They weren't really keeping peace. However, this is bad because, like I said, there was division among the church and Europe, and they were fighting and killing each other and so forth. And so the Pope found one good way of stopping all that killing between Christians that was going on in Europe, and the way he did it was by saying, "Look, everybody, let's stop killing one another and let's go kill Muslims." And they all went, "Yeah, that sounds good. God wills it." So they put together the first crusade, and that set out in 1099, and the first Christian army in 1099 arrived in Jerusalem, and they laid siege to the city, and they were intending to simply starve the city of Jerusalem out. That had actually happened before, and it must have happened about 1700 years or so ago. That's immediate math. I may need to rework that, but that seems to be about when it was. And at that time, it was the Babylonians, and they truly destroyed the city of Rome, or the city of Jerusalem, and it happened again, this time under the hands of the Christian Crusaders. The Crusaders again intended to starve out the city of Jerusalem, as happened under the Babylonians. However, they heard that there was a giant Arab army advancing on them, so they decided they needed to spring things up. So they attacked the city, and they actually had an agreement with the mayor of the city of Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem, whatever he was, that the people would be treated with mercy. However, after they entered the city, they didn't honor that. So I have an eyewitness account here that I'm just simply going to read. They give an account of what happened when the Christian Crusaders entered the city of Jerusalem. It says, "Some of our men, and this was more merciful, cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. In the temple and portico of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and the bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers. How the victorious Christians rejoiced and exulted and sang, and this day marks the justification of all Christianity." Well, that's the quote from how the Christian Crusaders entered the city of Jerusalem. That wasn't the only thing that happened. One was that when they entered the city of Jerusalem, as might be expected, they found groups of Jews praying. the Crusaders slaughtered them. One of the eyewitnesses to the slaughter of the Jews sort of boasts that they did not take liberties with the young women. They simply speared them. Another says that the Crusaders abstained from sexual intercourse with their captives, quote, as much as health demanded. Not quite sure I know what to do with that, but that's what the eyewitness says. Other reports do say that rapes did frequently occur. So they did conquer Jerusalem. The First Crusade was victorious, and the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem lasted a century. Now, they set up 4 Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land, and again, all that went on for about 100 years. But then one of those, the kingdom of Edessa, fell in the year 1144, and a second crusade was organized to try to reclaim the losses from that defeat. 200,000 holy warriors left Europe to go out and recapture the Holy Lands. This time they failed, and most of them were killed. However, they did manage once again to kill a lot of Jews along the way and in the process. And then it turned out that in 1187, Saladin retook Jerusalem. Remember, Saladin was that leader who Richard the Lionhearted was fighting in that movie starring Errol Flynn. And actually, Richard the Lionhearted and Saladin did end their fighting in a truce, but it also did end with Saladin reclaiming the city of Jerusalem. Well, there were other crusades that happened during all this time. There are a bunch of them, several of them at least, that are probably considered to be the most pitiful of the crusades. And these were, and you may have heard of them, the Children's Crusades. This was kind of a bizarre story. That fills the annals of church history, Christian history in one way or another. There was a boy in France named Stephen, and Stephen said that he had one of these special revelations from Jesus, that it was supposed to be children who were going to have to go out and accomplish what the Crusaders were not able to accomplish. Because of their innocence, they would accomplish what the spears and the swords of the Crusaders could not achieve. So this incited a lot of energy, excited a lot of people, especially children, and they joined with Stephen and they marched south to board ships to sail to the Holy Land and engage in warfare again. They encountered many hardships, especially as they tried to cross the Alps into Italy. Along the way, the German children were ordered by the Pope to turn back, and so they did. It was mostly French children who continued the march, and they finally achieved their goal of getting to Italy, and they did board ships. And when they boarded the ships, as you just might expect, things didn't go terribly well. 5,000 of them set sail, but some of the boats were sunk on the way. Others, the children actually were kidnapped by the ship's crews and were sold into slavery. And actually none of the children ever reached Jerusalem. The last crusade did briefly regain control of Jerusalem, but its Christian king was eventually captured and forced to pay ransom, and in 1270 died of fever. And that was sort of the end of these major crusades into the Holy Lands against Palestine. But from time to time, the Pope would continue to call for crusades, especially against heretics and heretical movements and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a bit as well. Well, the crusades ultimately resulted in defeat for the European Crusaders as they headed down to into the Holy Lands to do battle with the Muslims. But there were a number of things that came out of out of the Crusades, for one thing, it did extend the reach of Christianity and even Western civilization. The Roman Catholic Church did see an increase in its own wealth and in the power of the papacy. Trade and transportation also improved during and after the Crusades. Also, the wars created, as they always do, don't they, constant demand for supplies and for transportation, resulted in shipbuilding, manufacturing of various supplies, moved society forward in some of those kinds of ways, if you consider that moving forward, and why not? But also, after the Crusades, people knew about the places that the Crusaders had been, the holy sites and other places, and so they were interested in travel. The interest in learning increased throughout Europe. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. However, and this is really very important, among Islam, the Crusades were considered immoral and violent and savage, and the ruthlessness and the widespread massacre of Muslims and Jews and other non-Christians resulted in a great deal of bitterness towards Christianity, persisted for many years. As a matter of fact, it still exists. And you may recall during some of the recent Middle Eastern wars, like when we went into Iraq and so forth, the Muslims said that this was another crusade, that we were continuing, Christians, we Christian nation, we were just continuing to do what we had always done, and that is go do war against Islam. We might want to argue whether that was really what was going on, but that was certainly the point that they made about it. Anyway, the point is that the Crusades had didn't accomplish much militarily speaking and so forth, but had a lot of cultural impact on Europe, and we're going to talk about some of these things. One of them, I already mentioned it very briefly, was new learning. Remember that we're talking about a period of time here in which we talk about this period of time as being Europe's dark ages. And as we talked about last time, it was only in the monasteries that learning was honored and continued on and held out a light of hope and learning in Europe. But that wasn't the case in Muslim countries. Muslim countries were quite advanced. We could spend some time talking about their interest in and their progress in matters of science. They were also very much into Greek philosophy, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more too, a little bit more. There's also the matter of their mathematics. And one result of the Crusades was they came back with some Muslim math, and that's why our system of counting and doing math uses Arabic numerals, not Latin numerals. So I don't know. I like our Arabic numerals just fine, don't you? I think I would rather be using them than those Roman numerals. But nevertheless, it's whatever you're used to, I guess. But anyway, also that was going on at the time was an interest in learning in Europe. We saw the rise of some great universities happening in Europe, and so it provided an opportunity for these advances in learning that were coming out of the Muslim countries to take root and to grow. Just one of the developments that happened during that time happened in Paris. There was a priest who was teaching there. His name was Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, again, teaching there in Europe, was considered, and still is, I guess, the most original, thorough, and influential thinker since Augustine. At least up to that time, we Protestants can probably pick out a few that we think were probably greater and more influential. We'll talk about some of them again as time goes by. But nevertheless, Thomas Aquinas was working there. He attracted students from all over Europe, and they were profoundly influenced by him and others through his writings, and they still are influenced by the writings of Thomas Aquinas. When I say they, I mean people all around the world. I remember there was in Houston, where we were for some time, there is a university. Right now it's St. Thomas University, and there is an Aquinas Center there. But one of the things that Aquinas was most famous for, he was a very great rationalist. Everything had to make sense, and that faith was certainly essential, but faith would not lead you to someplace counter to reason. So in one sense, Thomas was reconciling faith and science at his time, even though, of course, science was not very far advanced at all. But nevertheless, Thomas was making an argument that works for that. But his greatest thing was his his 4 classic proofs of the existence of God. I'm not going to go into them in great deal, but just as a couple of examples are the proof of God in creation. Look at everything that's around here. It's proof God exists. There's the moral argument. There's a moral capacity in human beings that because that's there, that's a proof of God. And he elaborated a couple of others as well. That might be worth something studying at some point in time. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas, one thing that really came out of this particular period, and again, his influence continues. We've talked a lot about the papacy. The Crusades essentially came about because the Pope said, let's go do it, and people went, okay. And the Pope obviously had a great deal of power during these centuries that we're talking about here. The papacy, as you may know, was essentially like another royal house in Europe. And the papacy did nothing to try to dissuade people from thinking of it, because the papacy was just considered to be the head of state, and the state that they were talking about was not just Vatican or Rome, but it had the state was the church. There was the secular government and there was the church government. And there was great conflict on who had the greatest sense of authority. And it wavered back and forth. And just like there were good kings and bad kings, there were good popes and bad popes. The popes, as I said, were just like another royal house in Europe. Some of them had children, some of them had tremendous wealth, lived in great palaces, and this was at a time when most Europeans lived in virtual squalor. But there was the Pope living like a king, because in effect the Pope was a king, and the Pope had an army. I keep thinking about in World War II, Stalin was famous for expressing the fact that he had not much concern how the Pope felt about certain things by asking the question, how many divisions has the Pope? And the answer was, of course, none, so nothing to worry about. However, it wasn't always the case. Pope did have an army. I'm not sure quite how long that lasted in history, but it was certainly there. While, as I said, there were good popes and bad popes, there were good popes. There were popes who did try to live lives that were honoring of Christ, and they were dedicated servants of Christ. But at other times, the papacy was like any other royal house in Europe, and that was that there were struggles over the power of the papacy. And there were times when there were competing popes. There was a pope in Rome, there was a pope in France. And at one time, there were even 3 popes struggling for power. And finally, as the churches want to do, held a council, decided that there was only going to be one pope, and that was going to be the pope who was going to be living in Rome. So that finally was settled. Well, there were other movements going on during that time, as well as what the Pope was up to. We had certain people, monks and mystics, who were at work during this time. And I'm going to mention just a couple of the more major of those figures during this particular time. One of them was a man named Bernard of Clairvaux in France. Bernard gathered 30 friends around him, and they all joined a monastery in France. And their goal, if you can remember, we talked about Benedict, and he formed a movement of monasteries early on, and he had a rule, the rule of Benedict, which dictated how monks were going to live their lives. And Bernard wanted to return to those thrilling days of yesteryear with the more intense rule of the rule of Benedict, and he even increased the intensity of the rule of Benedict, and eventually his movement grew very rapidly. He himself founded 163 monasteries, and by the time he died, that number had increased to 343 monasteries around Europe that were under the direct influence of Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was profoundly influenced by the human Jesus and his life. Again, a return more to the teachings of the founder of the religion than simply the dictates of the institution that called itself by that name. There are a number of hymns that are attributed to Bernard that we still sing, or at least we did until things radically changed in the last few years as far as church music is concerned. But some of you will remember these hymns from at one point or time or another. The hymn, "O Sacred Head Now Wounded," and "Jesus, the very thought of thee," and "Jesus, thou joy of loving hearts," come to us after all these centuries from a French monk, Bernard of Clairvaux. Other works came out during this time, mentioned very briefly. A man named Thomas à Kempis wrote something called The Imitation of Christ. And again, some of these works like that one, still read. I don't know how widely anymore. Again, our reading patterns, even as Christians, has changed radically in recent years. But that's one that had a tremendous influence for a very long period of time. We talk about these saints of the Middle Ages, and there is one that all of us are familiar with to a certain extent or another, and probably the best known of them, and also the most influential of them. And the more we know of his life, the more we are, I think, moved and impressed by him. And his name was Francis of Assisi. Francis was the son of a rich Italian cloth merchant, and went off to fight in one of the many European wars, and came back extremely disillusioned by the reality of war and by the society that produced all of those wars, and decided to reject it. And he had a vision in Rome and heard God say to him, "Build my church." So he went back to his village of Assisi, and there was a small church in ruins nearby there. And so, following the dictates of his vision, he set about rebuilding that church. In addition to that, he developed a radically Christ-like lifestyle. Now, he spent a lot of money rebuilding that church, and his father wasn't very happy with it, so he went to the bishop, his father, and renounced Francis for what he was doing and spending all the money and so forth. And Francis himself responded by renouncing his inheritance of his father's money, and even removed his own robe and walked naked through the streets of the town as an illustration of how he renounced all worldly goods, and saying that he would take for his bride Lady Poverty. And he truly did it. Wore just a simple robe tied together by a rope, went barefooted, only took what he needed for that day's food, and if it happened that his robe wore out, then he would allow someone to give him a gift of a new robe or a different robe. And again, went about barefooted and poured out his life to the poor, the beggars, the needy. There was one story about St. Francis about how passed a beggar on the street who begged from him, and St. Francis realized that he had nothing at all that he could give this man, so he just simply walked on past. And after he got past him, he realized that he did have something that he could give this man, which was simply love. And so Francis went back to the man, and he sat down on the ground next to him and embraced him and simply told him how much he loved him. Just shared love if there was nothing else to share. Anyway, Francis also was a great lover of nature. I think we may have all heard the stories about how St. Francis even preached to the birds, and you see statues regularly. If you don't know who it was, you see a man in a monk's robe with birds around him, and that's St. Francis preaching to the birds. And he also expressed his love of nature, and one of his was called Ode to the Sun, which we know of as our hymn, All Creatures of Our God and King, from the heart and mind and hand of St. Francis of Assisi, praising all of the elements of nature, brother sun, sister moon, on and on and on. And then finally, even, oh, gentle sister death. That all of nature, all of life, a blessing from God to be celebrated. It's a wonderful story. The story of Francis has provided probably the very best loved model of Christ-likeness in all of church history, and he continues to inspire. Well, last thing I want to talk about here this morning, just a few minutes to talk about one of my favorite topics, and maybe everybody else's too, and that's heretics. Yeah, we need to talk about them. Actually, heretics are really important. They're important for a couple of reasons. One is that the heretics, we talked about them early on, Arius versus Athanasius. It was by fighting against Arius that Athanasius determined what was going to be Orthodox Christianity and our image of Jesus as being fully human and fully divine coming out of that controversy. That was important. Other heretics are important because they help us move forward. They cause us to question certain ideas and certain doctrines, help us maybe improve them and move forward. So we're going to hear a couple of those examples here in just a little bit. It was also in part because of the Crusades that there were Christians in Europe who began to question some of the principal doctrines of Roman Catholicism because they had encountered Eastern Christianity and also Islam, and they I don't know if you can hear my dog now. He gets disturbed when anybody walks by, so it seems to be happening right now. We'll see how badly this gets. It's too early for the mailman or we'd be in real trouble. But at any rate, so there was this exposure to new ideas, and people began to question some things about Orthodox Christianity. For instance, in southern Italy, there was a group called the Albigensians. And they had an idea that, and this is again nothing new, but they were promoting this idea. I'm sure they had their own twist to it. And that idea was that this material world that we are a part of is evil. It is the prison of souls. And because this is evil, then obviously Jesus couldn't be a part of it. So Jesus did not have a body. It looked like he did, but it was an illusion. They also taught that souls might be reincarnated, especially if they're sinful souls. They might be reincarnated as animals even. And so the church set out to crush them and did so. Don't know of any Albigensians out there. So they did stop that movement pretty well cold, you might say. There were others. There was another one of the famous examples of how the Christian church has not exactly looked very much like Jesus, that, like the Crusades, is held up on a regular basis, and maybe as well it should be, and that was the Inquisition. Mostly happened in Spain. But I'm a little confused right now. I don't know the real answer to this, but there may still be an office of the Inquisition in the Vatican. There certainly was one until not very many years ago, if it has been stopped. So that is an institution that has not totally disappeared. Nevertheless, the Inquisition happened as a way of crushing heresy. However, it was often used for reasons other than simply getting rid of bad doctrine. For instance, the Inquisition often was most practiced in wealthy areas, and the reason was that if you convicted somebody of heresy, then the church could claim their property, even if your property came from a grandfather who was declared to be a heretic. Then the church could claim your property. So there was much persecution of heretics under the Inquisition, and when persuasion of heretics failed, then they did resort to torture, and sometimes that finally led to burning at the stake. And interestingly, in all the records of the Spanish Inquisition, there is no record of anyone ever having been acquitted of heresy. Of course, there were Muslims in Spain, and the Christians were certainly not adverse to using the sword to bring Muslims into baptism, and certainly Jews. Jews were offered death or baptism, and in 1492, when Columbus set off from Spain to discover the New World, Spain was attempting to expel from its borders all Jews. And the Jews were subjected to great persecution, torture, and death under the Spanish Inquisition. Remember that Spain, for a while, parts of Spain at least, were ruled by the Muslims, and the Jews today remember that they were better treated under the Muslims than they were after the Christians retook control. Something for us, I think, to consider. Okay, now, I said that some heretics help us to re-examine some ideas and to help move us forward. And some heretics actually laid the foundation for the Protestant Reformation, which we're going to get into, I think, even next week, at least looking at the foundations that were laid for that. There was a man named Waldo, and it was in the late 12th century. He practiced and preached a life of poverty and obedience to the Sermon on the Mount. He also translated part of the Bible from Latin into the language of the common people, which itself did not go over very well, but he also sent unordained preachers out into communities to teach the scriptures that he had translated. And of course, the Pope didn't like this, so the Pope refused to authorize his work. However, his followers, called the Waldensians, did survive. They continued his work. They preached a doctrine that was so close to the Protestant reformers who came later that they eventually became part of the Presbyterian family of Reformed Christians. And in fact, there is a city in North Carolina called Valdez, which traces its heritage to Waldensian immigrants. And there are still Waldensian churches in Italy. Now we come to a man who had profound influence. His name was John Wycliffe. He was in 14th century England, and he attacked the idea that the church should be controlled by the hierarchy. He was one who, like Augustine, distinguished the Catholic Church from the kingdom of God. And Wycliffe said that the church was not the hierarchy of Christians. The church was the elect. A word that we don't like very much these days, but there we find an important seed being planted. It had been planted before, of course, even back with Augustine, that really did come into fruition with the reformers, especially Calvin. But Wycliffe said that the Bible, not the Pope, should be the ultimate authority for the church. And he translated the Bible out of Latin into English. And he was forced out of his position as a teacher at Oxford. He was protected by a wealthy nobleman and allowed to continue his work as a parish priest. But of course, as happens to all of us, he died. When he died, he was buried in consecrated ground, which again, we Protestants don't have much appreciation for that, but it's important to Catholics. It was important to Wycliffe, and he was buried in consecrated ground. However, 30 years later, another council was held, and this council declared Wycliffe a heretic. And since he was a heretic, even if he had been dead 30 years, they went and dug up his bones and burned them and scattered what was left of them in the river. And that'll teach him. Anyway, not wanting any Bibles out there that were not authorized by the church, especially those in the language of common people, they did gather up all of the copies of Wycliffe's Bible and they burned them. However, his Bible did become a model for all English translations that followed, including a couple of centuries later, one commissioned by a man named King James, the King James Bible, and actually the subsequent editions of the English Bible, all influenced by Wycliffe. Little added note here, if you're interested, there has been an organization out there which I think is still in existence. Their goal has been to seek out primitive tribes around the world who may not even have a written language, and go into them, those cultures, and spend time with them and create a written language that had not been done before, and then to translate the scriptures into that written language of those primitive tribes. That organization is called the Wycliffe Translators. Okay, just a little tidbit there. Another one we want to talk about is John Huss. This is back on the continent of Europe. John Huss took up the cause of Wycliffe. He preached against all those things that were going on, like rival popes. He argued that indulgences, remember I mentioned those, we'll talk more about them probably next week, which way you could buy yourself or buy somebody else out of purgatory, that indulgences brought no forgiveness of sins. He again taught that the Bible should be the authority, not the Pope. He was excommunicated, was forced to leave his position at the University of Prague. He was finally arrested and brought to trial and condemned to be burned at the stake. And at the stake, he prayed, "Lord Jesus, it is for thee that I endure this cruel death. I pray thee to have mercy on my enemies." So that was John Huss. Well, if you remember the line that the blood of the martyrs is the seeds of the church, it was true of Huss, and people were horrified by his death. They drew a lot of support from his ideas, from his doctrines, and his movement grew. The Pope did send a crusade to crush the Waldensians. Actually, not the Waldensians. I mean, these followers of John Huss who followed Wycliffe. However, the Crusaders from the Pope were defeated. However, some of his followers, especially in the area of Moravia, found common cause sometime later with the Lutherans, and they experienced heavy persecution from the Habsburg emperors. Some then did also ally with the Calvinists again, who were more our direct ancestors. And in the 17th century, Bishop John Amos Comenius, he rallied these followers of John Huss, the Hussites, and because of their roots in Moravia, they came to be called Moravians. They were pre-Reformation Protestants, and they not only were, they continue their work today. They are widely admired by people outside their fold for their worldwide evangelistic missions, for their deeds of service around the world, and their sometimes